Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. We got a World War III alert. I got some late breaking news the revolutionaries could use. North Korea, dead man nuclear switch. That means if Trump play with them, it's all over. But before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, Trump did it to himself. Put all our life in danger. Let's get into the content. Salute. Korea said they're not going out like the Iranians. If anything happened to Kim, everybody did.
North Korea has declared it is no longer bound by global nuclear non-proliferation treaties while unveiling a doctrine that could trigger an automatic nuclear strike if Kim Jong-un is killed during war. The move marks one of Pyongyang's most dangerous escalations in years and has alarmed Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. Pyongyang's revised constitution reportedly orders an immediate nuclear response if the country's command and control system is threatened during an attack. Analysts say the new policy resembles Cold War dead hand retaliation systems designed to ensure nuclear revenge even after leadership destruction. The constitutional shift reportedly came after North Korea closely studied the US-Israel strikes on Iran that rapidly eliminated senior leadership figures. South Korean intelligence believes Pyongyang now fears a similar decapitation strike could one day target Kim Jong-un and the country's military command. North Korea is also openly rejecting the global arms control system by insisting it is no longer bound by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Pyongyang says its nuclear arsenal is permanent and non-negotiable, signaling that future diplomacy with Washington may become even more difficult. The escalation comes as North Korea deploys new long-range artillery systems near the South Korean border, placing Seoul within striking range. Experts warn the combination of automatic nuclear retaliation and rising military pressure could sharply increase the risk of rapid escalation in any future conflict.
So North Korea done put them on notice. If you try that shit you did with Iran with us, we're gonna kill everybody. Russia is the country that I knew had the dead man switch. Where if anything happened to their leadership, everybody dies. Now North Korea, they done put it into their military doctrine. If Trump or the U.S. try anything, they automatically nuke the U.S. They don't need no confirmation. And that's exactly what the Iranians gonna have in about a year or so. They're gonna have the dead man switch. So if the U.S. and Israel keep trying that shit, the whole world gonna go up in flames.
Iran has deployed stealthy Ghadir submarines into the Strait of Hormuz, signaling a dangerous new underwater threat in the world's most critical oil choke point. Tehran says the submarines can remain hidden on the seabed while tracking or attacking hostile vessels.
Stability on the seabed and in the depths of the waters of the Strait of Hormuz for long periods, and tracking and destroying various types of enemy vessels are among the capabilities of the light submarines.
Nearly 1/5 of global oil shipments pass through the Strait of Hormuz, making Iran's submarine deployment a major geopolitical warning. Analysts fear even limited underwater disruption could trigger oil shocks, tanker panic, and rapid military escalation.
The Persian Gulf dolphins appeared on the surface of the water in the Strait of Hormuz before diving again to continue assigned combat missions.
Iranian media described the submarines as trigger-ready, reinforcing Tehran's strategy of asymmetric warfare against superior naval powers. The shallow waters of the Gulf allow stealth submarines to hide, ambush warships, and complicate Western naval operations.
These submarines are known in the daily discourse of officers and non-commissioned officers as the dolphins of the Persian Gulf.
And I reported on that 2 days ago in the live stream that Iran had sent their Dolphin-class submarines and they smaller submarines to patrol the Strait of Hormuz. Trump never talked about that. These little baby subs, perfect, made just for the Strait of Hormuz. Trump say destroyed their Navy. Man, he ain't even began to fight their Navy. And any U.S. or NATO battleships can make it to the Strait, which they really can't. If they dare make it, then them submarines gonna sink the ships and kill those troops, which the small hats and these people don't give a damn about. They want Kim Jong-un to nuke the world. They say it's too many of us going wasteful eaters on this planet.
Bizarre side controversy erupted after reports claimed Iran possessed kamikaze dolphins. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth dismissed the reports, but joked that America might have such capabilities, reviving attention on military marine mammal programs.
You said that the attacks by Iran so far are below the threshold of restarting major combat operations. What is that threshold? And then for Secretary Hegseth, are there still concerns about mines in the Strait? And can you kind of clarify these reports of kamikaze dolphins that we've heard about?
I haven't heard the kamikaze dolphin thing. It's like sharks with laser beams, right? The threshold of restarting is a political decision above my pay grade. What I'll say is it's low harassing fire right now.
And I can't confirm or deny whether we have kamikaze dolphins, but I can confirm they don't. Ultimately,
The deployment has intensified fears that the next Gulf confrontation could begin underwater, with warships, oil tankers, and surveillance forces operating in close proximity. Even a minor submarine incident inside Hormuz could trigger a wider global security and energy crisis.
Another day, another U.S. F-35 under scrutiny as Iran-linked claims swirl around
I
a
was waiting on more reliable reporting on this, but this is another source. I've seen several sources yesterday talk about this, so I'm going to bring it to the channel, let y'all see it. 2 U.S. F-35s have reported distress signals over the Strait of Hormuz, and then rushed towards United Arab Emirates, I'm pretty sure that Iranians' air defense systems locked on their ass and they got the hell up out of there. They might even been struck. But the U.S. not reporting on this because it's ultimate humiliation. They don't want to tell the world. But this was their pattern. They don't say nothing unless the Iranians tell us and then show the video. If the Iranians don't show the video, the U.S. never tell the truth. But people who tracking the data, people tracking the flight radar, people could see these planes on these apps that they have, and then they can hear the distress signal, all that type of shit. That's really crazy that you can stalk these planes like that.
Fresh emergency involving the stealth jet near Hormuz. Trump's F-35 reportedly made a hard landing in the United Arab Emirates after operating near the Strait of Hormuz. For the second time in 24 hours, a U.S. F-35 reportedly triggered the 7700 emergency code, fueling new questions around America's so-called invisible jet in the Gulf theater. A U.S. F-35 Lightning II fighter jet reportedly made an emergency landing in the UAE on May 11th after an in-flight issue near the Strait of Hormuz. The American fighter is said to have transmitted the emergency transponder code 7700 before diverting toward the UAE. The Cradle and other reports said the emergency code was transmitted while the jet was operating near the Strait of Hormuz.
You don't know what an AI work management platform is? Okay, let me tell you. Here's 3 new AI-powered changes.
The Cradle reported, and I quote, "After declaring the emergency this morning, the aircraft changed course from the direction of the Gulf of Oman toward the United Arab Emirates. The jet stopped transmitting while in UAE airspace and made a hard landing at Al Dhafra Air Base. U.S. officials have not yet issued a statement," unquote. The code 7700 is the international transponder signal pilots use to declare a general emergency in flight. Notably, reports describe this as the second time in roughly 24 hours that a U.S. F-35 transmitted the code 7700 in the region. A U.S. Air Force F-35 Lightning II reportedly transmitted the emergency code 7700 on May 10th, suggesting a possible in-flight emergency during heightened regional tensions. The 7700 code was reportedly transmitted while the aircraft was flying over or near the Sea of Oman, according to claims circulating in regional and flight tracking-based reports. Iran's Fars news agency and affiliated reporting have pushed the latest incident into the spotlight as tensions remain elevated across the Gulf. Fars news agency said, and I quote, "Minutes ago, a U.S. Air Force F-35 Lightning II fighter jet transmitted emergency code 7700 while flying over the Sea of Oman. The transmission of this code indicates the presence of an emergency and urgent situation that requires landing," unquote. The reported emergency came on the same day a bulk carrier was hit in the region, adding to a sense of mounting instability around key Gulf transit routes. The incident triggered a small fire on board, according to the UKMTO statement, though all crew were reported safe. The vessel was hit while sailing northeast of Doha, Qatar, with UKMTO advisories in similar incidents placing the strike zone in waters off Qatar. UK Maritime Trade Operations Organization said, and I quote, "UKMTO has received a report of an incident 23 nm northeast of Doha, Qatar. The master of a bulk carrier reports being hit by an unknown projectile. There was a small fire that has been extinguished. There are no casualties. There is no reported environmental impact. Authorities are investigating. Vessels are advised to transit with caution and report any suspicious activity to UKMTO," unquote. The incident came amid heightened regional tensions following fresh IRGC warnings about retaliation in Gulf waters. Iran's IRGC has issued a sharp warning against any attacks on the nation's oil tankers or commercial vessels, framing them as a red line in the ongoing standoff with the United States. Tehran threatened that any fresh strike on Iranian shipping would trigger a heavy attack on U.S. military bases and allied warships operating.
We already know that. I just wanted y'all to see 2 F-35s sent distress signals out over the Strait of Hormuz, got their butt up out of there. They didn't want no smoke. Iran too strong in the Strait of Hormuz, so we needed to verify that. Now, this next story, I don't know if this is true, but I got to report it because, hey, the Iranians might do it. The cutting of the undersea cables for the global internet. Now, they blame the same shit on the Russians in the Ukraine war. So now they're saying it's the Iranians. I absolutely believe it's the CIA who will cut the internet, blame Iran. So we got to sit back and listen to this story because when Russia was fighting Ukraine, they said the Russians was about to do it. Now they saying Iranians about to do it. So that gives me a feeling it's really them that small hats threatening the whole world internet. You know, if the Iranians don't surrender, they're going to blame it on Iran.
But while Washington is focused on the diplomatic deadlock, Iran appears to be expanding the battlefield into a layer that most people rarely think about: the undersea internet cables that run through the Strait of Hormuz. According to reports,
I have yet to see the Iranians say they will cut the internet. They don't have. Listen, the Iranians need the internet. That is working for them. They want all of us to see those Lego videos. They want all of us to see the devastating destruction that they're causing on the Americans. Who don't want you to see that? The small hats in the U.S. But let's proceed.
From the IRGC-linked media, Iran has floated the idea of taking control over the undersea internet cables that pass through the strait, requiring foreign operators to obtain permits, to pay fees, to operate under the Iranian law, and rely on Iranian companies for management, repair, and maintenance of those cables.
Now, that could be true, but they never threaten to cut them. It could be true. They saying wherever internet goes through the strait, you now have to deal with them. That's okay, cool. They never said nothing about cutting it. They saying, hey, if you're not paying, then you don't get to use the underwater cables. But they never said they was going to cut it. I've seen reports they're talking about cutting the global internet, and that's not true. That would not be good in their favor to do that.
For over 2 months now, the world has been watching the Hormuz through that familiar lens by now of tankers, naval escorts, oil prices, insurance premiums, and the risk of an energy shock, especially with oil jumping from around $60 before the war to more than $120. But now Iran is considering another layer of pressure. Beneath those same waters runs a system that is much less visible than oil tankers, but in some ways even more important to the modern economy: the fiber optic cables that carry the data between Europe, the Gulf, and Asia. These are not just internet lines in a casual sense. They're routes which we use for banking settlements, cloud computing, AI services, telecom networks, financial messaging, e-commerce, and the daily digital traffic that allows modern economies to function. The submarine fiber optic cables passing through the straits are said to carry more than $10 trillion in financial transactions alone each day. Reuters reported a couple of weeks ago that Iran had warned that submarine cables in the Strait of Hormuz were a vulnerable point for the region's digital economy, and that raised concerns at the time about possible attacks on critical infrastructure. Several fiber optic cables that cross the seabed of the strait connect India and Southeast Asia to Europe through the Gulf states and Egypt. Now, the Iranian Fars news agency is reportedly taking that warning one step further. The issue is no longer only that the cables are vulnerable. The issue is that Iran may try to regulate them, and that distinction matters. A threat to cut a cable is straightforward sabotage. A plan to require permits, fees, Iranian legal compliance, and Iranian-controlled maintenance is something far more institutional. It's Iran trying to convert this wartime leverage into a permanent governing structure over those physical routes of the internet in the Strait of Hormuz. And that is why this moment is actually very, very significant. The Hormuz Strait crisis, which started with those oil tankers, Then came that toll system with ships reportedly being asked to pay over $2 million fees to cross the straits. Then we came along with the Iranian proposals for a long-term transit management under the 12-article parliamentary law that was designed to formalize Iranian control. And now the same logic is being applied to the undersea internet cables. The United States and Israeli actions created this crisis. What it did was give Iran an opportunity and an understanding that it should use its leverage to build a new authority and legitimacy for its rule over the straits before any final deal now is being signed with the United States. And I want to walk you through why that matters, because the consequences go well beyond internet connectivity. They go straight to the heart of what the Gulf is actually trying to become. If Iran is able to do what it's threatening, then it is not simply saying we can hurt the Gulf. It is saying something far more strategic. That is, the Gulf's future passes through the infrastructure that the Iranians can tax, delay, regulate, or politically expose whenever they want to. And the timing's not random. The Gulf states have spent the last decade trying to move their economies beyond oil, reinventing themselves as centers of the post-oil economy world. And they've made real progress, especially the UAE. But even the Saudis, they're not just selling energy anymore. They're selling cloud capacity, AI infrastructure, finance, logistics, tourism, and digital connectivity. Amazon has committed over $5 billion to Saudi Arabia. Microsoft has announced a $15 billion investment in the UAE with OpenAI and G42, the UAE state company, which is involved in Stargate. Now, the UAE has a huge artificial intelligence campus that it's set up in Abu Dhabi, and that project is planned as a 5-gigawatt AI campus, with the first 200 megawatts that were expected to come online later this year. And the broader complex has been described as being the largest AI data center project outside the United States. It's going to have US money in there. It's one of those rare projects that President Trump himself has given the go-ahead to have investment outside the United States. It's part of his initial first trip that he made out of the US when he came to the Middle East, and he got these trillions of dollars of projects that he talks about now. Now, that's the future that the Gulf has been marketing to the world. And the pitch has been, no, we're not just an energy region any longer. We're now this cloud infrastructure, this place where you're going to have this massive compute capacity. We are where the digital economy is going to come to scale, not just ports and pipelines and hydrocarbons any longer, but now you're going to find cloud, data, and AI campuses here. But this war has exposed the weakness in that model. They're still in the Middle East. This is the Middle East. And none of these countries can fully pretend that they're these isolated oases of stability and calm. Because none of this digital ambition exists in abstract. It depends on physical infrastructure in the neighborhood. It depends on cables, landing stations, data centers, repair vessels, power grids, permits, insurance, and the assumption that traffic can move freely through the region without becoming a political or a geopolitical hostage, I should say. Now, that assumption, of course, is being challenged. According to the numbers now circulating around, this Iranian proposal, the Strait of Hormuz cable layer, which includes 7 undersea internet cables, sits within this wider environment of 17 fiber optic systems, and it may touch as much as 30% of international internet traffic, which links Europe, Gulf, and Asia. It's not just one isolated cable. It's a whole regional data corridor. And Iran is now suggesting that it may actually try and control it. And here's the asymmetry that makes Iran's position so deliberate. The Gulf states reportedly depend on these cables for more than 90% of their internet, banking, and cloud infrastructure, while Iran itself relies on it for less than 40% of its traffic, because a lot of its traffic can be routed overland through Turkey. And that is the heart of its strategy. So that same asymmetry that defines the oil blockade also defines now the data blockade if Iran goes ahead with this. The Gulf is far more exposed to the maritime corridor than it remembered. Iran believes it has more room to absorb the shock than the Gulf states. So it can threaten infrastructure that the other countries depend on far more than it does itself. And that's why this isn't just a random threat. It is targeted at the Gulf's post-oil transformation, at the heart of the Gulf's economic transformation. The UAE and Saudi Arabia want to become these AI hubs. But AI doesn't only require chips and electricity, it requires reliable connectivity. It requires low latency data movement. It requires trust from banks, from cloud providers, from hyperscalers like Microsoft, multinational companies, and foreign investors. If undersea cables become subject to Iranian permits, fees, Iranian law, and even Iranian control, then the Gulf digital infrastructure starts to look much more risky. It starts carrying what is known as a political risk premium. And that's exactly what Tehran wants them to feel. Iran doesn't need to shut down the internet to create its leverage. It only needs to make these companies wonder about the cables beneath the Hormuz. Are they still going to be neutral infrastructure? It only needs to make these insurance companies hesitate. It only needs to make those repair vessels question whether they can operate safely. It only needs to make those cloud providers build much more redundancy now. Banks need to prepare for delays, and the Gulf governments need to worry that their AI future can be pressurized through, once more, this narrow strait, the Strait of Hormuz. And we already saw first warning signs earlier this year. Reuters reported that Amazon's cloud unit flagged problems at data centers in Bahrain and the UAE after the Iranian strikes. And these disruptions affected cloud services and regional financial institutions. And that was just the data centers. Cable disruption would be a different category of problem. The estimate now being circulated is that serious disruption to the cables could cause around $100 million per day in financial losses, which would force roughly 30% of the global internet traffic into going now into congested backup paths, and that would degrade all the AI services across 3 continents. And when these cloud services degrade, banking, trading, AI workloads, telecom networks, and e-commerce all begin to feel the pressure. And that's how the seabed issue becomes a massive global economic issue. The global subsea cable system, which normally experiences around 150 to 200 faults per year, with 70-80% of these faults which are caused by accidental human activity, such as those fishing ships that go out there, or ship anchors. But normally that kind of cable fault is an engineering problem. If we have the Strait of Hormuz during a war, it becomes a geopolitical problem. The repair issue, I think, is really genuinely underappreciated. Cable repair ships are not military vessels. Their operators are specialized civilian contractors. If the security environment deteriorates enough, then those contractors are simply not going to send their crews in. Their ships are going to stay home. That cable is then going to stay broken. And we have the insurance sector. How does that enter this story? Well, just as it did in the oil crisis, Iran doesn't even physically have to act for these insurers to start changing their risk calculations. If Lloyd's of London or other war risk underwriters add their region to the exclusion list, or if the premiums rise high enough, companies do not wait for a cable to actually be cut. They start rerouting preemptively. They build those contingency plans. They'll start redirecting their traffic before anything physically happens. And that's why this Iranian proposal is so clever for them. It doesn't rely only on destruction. It relies on control. That 12-article parliamentary law that put the Iranian Authority over the strait on a legal footing inside Iran, at least, if foreign operators have to obtain permits, Iran will suddenly get a lever. If they pay fees, Iran suddenly has a revenue driver. And if the IRGC has warned that these same cables could be targeted, then every technical discussion then becomes a security discussion. And that's much bigger crisis. And that's the part that Washington is now struggling to answer. The United States knows how to talk about the freedom of navigation, even though, like Iran, it hasn't even ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of Sea, which is supposed to protect the freedom of the seas. So it knows how to send these aircraft carriers, escort tankers, deploy its air defenses, and warn Iran against attacking ships. But that cable layer is much more complicated. How does Washington stop Iran from demanding permits? How does it guarantee the repair access to the ships? How does it prevent Tehran from using cable maintenance as a negotiating tool? How will it reassure Microsoft, Amazon, OpenAI, G42, Meta, various banks in the region, telecom operators, and the Gulf countries that the digital infrastructure will remain outside the war? That's the strategic problem that the United States has. Trump's Iran strategy was built around military pressure, but Iran is now using economic and infrastructure pressure to expose its dependency. The White House wanted to show that Iran was contained. Iran is trying to show that all the systems that were protected by the United States are actually exposed. Oil above the water, data beneath it, cloud facilities on land. And these Gulf allies are all caught between their digital ambition and their geographical vulnerability. And that's why this damages Trump politically. It makes Washington look reactive. That's why those Lego videos that the Iranians are making are becoming so popular. It always shows Trump one step behind. Every time the United States moves to secure one layer, Iran opens up another. Oil tankers became the first layer, shipping permits became the second, data centers became the third, undersea cables have now become the fourth. And now the question is whether this MOU that Washington is waiting to get Iran to sign even fully addresses the crisis. Because an agreement that only solves the oil layer may not solve that digital layer. Now, the market is already starting to understand this. Meta has reportedly paused its work on that two Africa Pearls extension in the Gulf because of the regional security risks with the cable layer, and they've declared force majeure and saying that they can no longer safely operate in the Persian Gulf. That section was meant to connect the Gulf states, Pakistan, and India. And that delay shows that the war is already affecting where that next generation of internet infrastructure is going to be built. Meta's longer-term answer is also revealing. It has something called Project Waterworth. It's roughly a 50,000-kilometer cable that's being planned to connect the United States, India, South Africa, and Brazil. The strategic meaning is obvious. Build those routes that reduce the dependence on the Middle East and other unstable choke points. So in other words, the war that was supposed to end quickly is now being priced into the longer-term architecture of the global internet. And that's a huge development. Because wars don't only change the borders or alliances, they are now changing infrastructure maps. They're changing where the companies are laying their cables, where they're building their data centers, where they're going to place their cloud regions, and whether governments actually feel safe hosting their data centers and their clouds in the Middle East, in those Gulf countries. And that's exactly what Iran is trying to exploit. The Gulf wanted to be indispensable to the future of AI. And Iran wants to show the world, actually, that the Gulf is still very vulnerable to the geography of the Hormuz. The United States that wanted to present itself as the guarantor of regional order, but that this United States security umbrella, which has been reasonably effective at protecting the oil tanker transit, very, very minimally effective, has a much less clear answer when it comes to digital infrastructure. You can send a carrier group to escort a tanker, but you can't send that carrier group to protect a cable maintenance crew. But there's no naval response to what is now here going to become a bureaucratic chokehold if Iran decides to go through with this. There is no missile defense system which you can use to stop regulatory obstruction. That gap between what America can actually guarantee and what the Gulf's digital economy needs is part of what Iran is deliberately exploiting here. Iran wants to prove that no guarantee is complete if Tehran can actually create friction at the choke point itself. And it wants the Gulf states to know it, to understand it. In particular, it definitely wants the UAE to understand it, especially every time it picks up the phone and speaks to the Israelis. The hyperscalers have also obviously started to understand it, and if it's not resolved, it's very quickly going to become a ceiling on how far the Gulf's transformation can go. Now, there is one more dimension here that does not get enough attention. If Western insurers do withdraw from the Hormuz, the cable operations and the Western repair contractors decide that that risk is too high, well, someone else is going to fill that gap. And the most capable alternative is China. Chinese companies, especially HMN Technologies, which were formerly the Huawei Marine, are among the world's leading cable layers and repair operators. They operate with a different risk tolerance. And China has a very different political relationship with Iran. And if those Western commercial and insurance ecosystem pulls back from the Strait of Hormuz, especially in terms of the cable operations, Chinese operators are the ones that are positioned to step in. And that's going to give China a quiet but a significant role in maintaining the digital infrastructure of the Gulf states, which are simultaneously trying to attract American AI investment and technology partnerships. And at the same time, the United States had been warning them about letting Huawei in to their 5G networks, especially. Now, that's not hypothetical example. It's actually going to be a very logical, natural consequence of this Western security vacuum if it is left in this particular way. Iran's used this crisis to push towards a rewrite of all those foundational rules which have governed the transit passage. And that matters because it explains the deeper objective. What Iran is now doing is it's not trying to win some temporary concessions any longer. It is trying to establish recognized sovereignty over the strait, not just in symbolic terms, but in operational terms. Who passes, who pays, who applies, who repairs, who manages, who writes the rules. Iran's central war aim now is to have its sovereignty recognized over the straits. And oil was that first argument. Data may now become the stronger one. Oil is visible, right? So tankers can be counted, ship movements can be tracked. Prices are measured in real time. They go into our gas engines. The data infrastructure, however, is hidden. We don't think about it really until it breaks down. And that invisibility actually gives Iran a lot more room to apply pressure without triggering the same immediate public or private reaction as it would, for example, if there was a tanker attack or a missile strike. Now, some analysts have said that more attention should be given to, let's say, moving towards satellite communications. But realistically, experts say that satellite systems are not feasible replacement for these subsea cables because they can't handle the same volume of traffic and are much more expensive. Low Earth orbit networks like, for example, Elon Musk's Starlink are useful for ships, aircraft, for remote locations and emergency backup, but they're not a replacement for wholesale undersea cable systems that carry the overwhelming majority of international data. So the world cannot just simply route around this overnight. It can build alternatives over time, but those alternatives will cost billions. They'll take years, and they're going to change the geography of digital power. That is why Meta's 50,000-kilometer Project Waterworth plan matters. It's not just a corporate cable project. It's a sign that major technology companies are already thinking about how to bypass unstable regions entirely. Now, for the Gulf, that should be alarming, because if the region becomes seen as too exposed to Iranian leverage, the next wave of digital infrastructure may not actually end up there. The UAE and Saudi Arabia may still build these massive AI campuses because they have the money, but the hyperscalers will demand much more redundancy and more guarantees, as well as keep alternative routes and possibly extract much more political concessions from them. Now that raises costs and it weakens that simple story that the Gulf states want to tell, that they can become secure, neutral, and globally connected hubs for the digital economy. Now, the same geography that made Hormuz powerful in the age of oil is now being used in the age of data. That strait is narrow and the routes are concentrated. The Gulf countries are dependent, and the repair environment is going to be very, very difficult if it needs to be undertaken. So they need to think about their actions, is what Iran is basically pushing them towards. They need to think about their geography, and they need to think about who their future is with. Iran is trying to turn all of that into a bargaining power here before the war ends. And that is the deeper pattern behind the Hormuz Management Law. It's not going to wait around for the peace settlement to define the rules. It's using the crisis itself now to create the facts on the strait. And if it succeeds, Hormuz will no longer be treated only as a passageway. It will become an administered choke point where energy, shipping, and data all move under the Iranian pressure. The world already understood that Iran could threaten the oil markets. And what is now being forced to understand is that Iran can also threaten the digital assumptions behind globalization. For Trump, this is the worst possible version of the crisis because it's turned a regional conflict into a system failure. It's exposed the weakness of his strategy that promised control, but didn't account for any of the many layers of global infrastructure that run through the Strait of Hormuz, which was already the world's oil choke point. And now Iran is trying to make it the data choke point as well. If Iran is able to establish even a partial permit regime over the Hormuz cables, even as a negotiation position, that, if it gets partially accepted in a peace deal, creates a template. The Bab el-Mandab has cables. The Malacca Strait has cables. The South China Sea has cables. Every contested waterway in the world now has an example of a territorial power making an administrative claim over cable transit rights. And if they receive even partial international recognition for it, then that argument that the undersea cables are a neutral infrastructure and not subject to political authority of the waters that they pass through, which has held for decades because nobody seriously challenged it in this way. Iran is challenging it. And the second time someone does it, it will be much easier because then the precedent will already exist. I'm Najma Minhas with GBS Deep Dive.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
All right, I'll let you get away with that. By the way, great shirt. You know, glad to see we continuing the tradition, trying to bring some light, some joy to a dark, dark world.
Yeah, exactly. Larry, I want to start with what Benjamin Netanyahu said on his interview on 60 Minutes. He mentioned that the United States, the war is not over, which was repeated, by the way, yesterday by Donald Trump. He said, we are not over with the war against Iran, and we have something like 70% of what we had in our mind before this war started. I don't know what does that mean, this 70%, where does it come from? But Benjamin Netanyahu said the same thing. We accomplished a lot. What is the mindset on the part of this 70%, and what do they want to achieve, and what have they achieved so far?
Were you going to play a clip or just will you jump into it?
No, we can jump in because 60 Minutes doesn't let us to use their clips. They're going to...
Oh, really?
Bring, yeah, they're going to bring our talk down and right after, and we have to remove it.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. What did the United States and Israel accomplish? They killed off one layer of leadership in Iran and brought together now a leadership group that all fought together, and not directly, but they all fought in the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 88. So now you've got a full government of combat veterans who've been to war. They know what war is.
So this notion that there's a great division between the so-called moderates and the so-called extremists, that's just a load of Western propaganda. Not true. Instead, you've probably got, I would argue, greater unity within Iran's leadership now than you've had at any time in the past. I'm not sure all of the previous, the ones. It is true. I guess I was told that even the Ayatollah Khamenei, the father, even he fought in the Iran-Iraq War. Of course, he would have been, well into his 40s at that time. What else did they accomplish? Oh, they basically got all of the U.S. military bases in the Gulf region deactivated or destroyed. And they got that accomplished so that the United States' its ability to sustain its presence in the Gulf is not what it was. They've depleted a large number of essential weapon systems. And to rebuild those, they need to go to China and beg China to give them the rare earth minerals in order to reproduce those. They've managed to unite the Iranian people around a government that previously there was opposition to, but now even those who were considered, like the Lego guys, those kids creating the Lego videos, they actually were previously somewhat critical of the government, but now, man, they're the most effective propaganda arm of the Iranian government. So something we've never ever seen before. Yeah, so great accomplishments by the West. Oh, I forgot the most important one. They achieved the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, the crippling of the global economy, and the likelihood that the United States and Europe will be faced with serious stagflation. Other than that, they still they haven't done much. So you get my sarcasm throughout this. This is an unmitigated disaster for the United States and Israel. Instead of weakening Iran, they've strengthened Iran, and through it, Iran has strengthened its relations with Russia and China. And in turn, Russia and China have seized this opening, seized the initiative to be moving forward with creating a new international security architecture in the Persian Gulf, one that displaces the United States and leaves the United States weaker, actually.
It seems that Iran response to Trump's proposal was somehow unthinkable on the part of Donald Trump. Because he came out here, Larry, said it totally unacceptable what Iran, had to say to this proposal. And basically what we've learned from the new proposal or the response from the Iranians, they're repeating the same points. They're not changing anything with that 10-point plan.
This is so reminiscent of what has gone on with Russia in terms of trying to negotiate with Russia and Trump's. Vladimir Putin laid out Russia's positions very clearly on June 14th, 2024, and they haven't deviated from that at all. Not at all. So here comes Iran and lays out, the four essential. There's a lot of, there are 6 other things, but the 4 critical ones are lift the sanctions, unfreeze the assets. We're going to control the Strait of Hormuz, and we'll talk later about nuclear enrichment and such. That's it. They haven't changed. And the United States keeps acting like this is something new and dramatic. So I think Iran understands that there is no real viable negotiation with the United States until such time that the economic chaos that is unfolding around the world hits the United States and creates enormous political pressure on Trump. I mean, right now he's only at about 33% support, maybe lower. So I saw him yesterday. He put out a Truth Social message about how he's happy with the polls. They're lying to him, absolutely lying to him. So he's got he's going to have to have a wake-up call at some point, and it'll only be then that there. I don't give much chance that negotiations will succeed. This war is not necessarily going to end through negotiations. It's going to end with the reality that the United States has to accept we no longer have the military power that we once thought we did. Oh boy, and that's good. That's going to be a shocking revelation, because the average American really believes, man, all we got to do is go in there and drive our battleships into the straits and blow up those Iranians and kick ass. It's just all we got to do is just have enough guts to do it. It's like, guys, you don't understand. Try that and see what happens.
But Larry, the tone in the United States, based on the latest polls, is changing, because 64% of Americans believe that the United States is not winning against Iran in the Middle East.
Correct.
And only 13% believe that the United States is winning.
Yep.
That's totally, against what Donald Trump is trying to picture for us.
Yeah.
With the beautiful AI generated photos that he's putting on his through social account.
Yeah. Hey, speaking of AI generated photos, that AI generated photo of me, come on, dude. I had to look and said, who is that? Yeah, no, but there's that's actually probably a good parallel. The Trump foreign policy it's being operated on artificial intelligence. And if you will, I had an experience with AI. I asked it a particular question to review a particular video, and it came back and said, yes, this video made by so-and-so. And it wasn't. I mean, it was someone else. So I wrote back to the AI. I said, hey, you're wrong. It's this. So it comes back and goes, oh, yeah, my bad. I made a mistake. So once you encounter that, you realize the limits of AI. And, some things are good, but some things are bad. And, Trump's foreign policy is just, it's a mess. There's no coordinated, coherent strategy at all. So, like, he's going over to meet Xi Jinping, right? And so what does the Trump administration do? It announces new sanctions against the Chinese company that took satellite photos that showed the reality of what was going on in the Middle East. Yeah, that I'm sure Xi's going to be real happy with that. So Trump, you want to find ways that you can make the trip as conflict free as possible. Instead, Trump seems to be heaping up one more contentious issue after another on the agenda.
The guy is totally confusing the foreign policy and diplomacy with what he knows as the deal, some sort of real estate deals that he was dealing with during his lifetime, I would say. And because whenever you put pressure on these countries, they're not in a cave, they're gonna fight back. This is the main reason that Russia is in its position in the way it is right now. Iran is the way that they're fighting back with the case of the blockade. They're not caving. That's the reason. I don't see China shows that today China is different from what it was, I would say, before 2022. And with the tariff war, we've seen how China hit back at the United States and how they were coming back and fighting the Trump administration. Yeah. I don't know how is it going to help Donald Trump, but it doesn't seem that he's learning anything when it comes to diplomacy and how to deal with how the foreign policy works, and he's continuing with the same sort of attitude.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was. There's the assumption that China is much weaker, or Iran is much weaker than is the case. I came upon a new statistic yesterday, or I'd asked about it, that because I was talking to someone who's making the case about how weak China was. I said, well, let's look at the debt to GDP ratio offhand. And I said, I'm not sure what it is for China, but I suspect it's far worse for the United States. And lo and behold, the numbers were this, that if you look at the central federal government only, sort of the national level government, China's debt to GDP ratio is 29%. That, what is that of the United States? 123%. It's probably higher now. Now, if you take in the broader government at all levels, like let's say at the national level, and then at the federal or the state level, whatever, or canton level, and down to cities and such. So take the broader government, all levels. The debt for China is 85% or 88%, and the United States is 140%. So again, the economic strength lies with China. And then if you take total economy-wide debt, like the average citizen, their debt, total debt for China is 302%. For the United States, 720%, or 719. Double, more than double. So my point in all of this is the United States is acting like China is an economic basket case, and we're like the guy who's a meth heroin addict going to talk to somebody about their drug addiction, that they have a problem. When they're only they're addicted to smoking cigars. We've got a far more critical problem. And then the way the world economy has changed. Right now, I think we made this point on Friday, that in 2000, Japan had 5 of the top 10 banks in the world. With the number 1 bank in the world at the time was considered Deutsche Bank in Germany, followed by BNP Paribas. Jump ahead now to 2025, China's got the 4 largest banks, followed by 2 American banks. And then you get, I think, the British HSBC, Paribas, BNP Paribas, and Mitsubishi. I think that rounds out the top. Notice that, Japan, 4 of the 5 banks disappeared off that list. And China has taken over. Now, this gets in. There's something called the derivatives market. So we saw this in 2008 with the collapse of the housing market. So a derivative means, let's say that let's do it like a casino. So you go in and you place a bet that you're going to on roulette that it's going to hit 12 red. Okay, so the first derivative is I'm standing in the audience watching you. So you know what? I'm going to bet you that Nima's going to win. And someone else says, oh, I'll take that bet. I'll bet you he's going to lose. And then you got another group of people that are sitting there watching, me watch you. And they go, you know what? I'm going to bet that Larry is right. And someone else said, no, I'm going to bet Larry's wrong. So now they're betting that my prediction about what you're going to do, that my prediction is going to be right or wrong, and then their prediction. And then someone else says, hey, you know what? I'm going to bet that those guys who are betting against Larry, so you see how this builds up. That's the derivative market. There's a derivative trader named Alex. He has a YouTube channel, Reportify, and he's been involved with the derivatives business for 20 years. And he says that market is $600 to $700 trillion. Basically speculative bets, people leveraged in such a way that if the bets go sideways, they could lose a lot of money. And what's interesting is he identified the top 10 banks that are involved with all this activity, none of them are Chinese. They're all Western banks. So what's interesting, I find that fascinating that the Chinese don't get directly involved with all this speculative stuff. That they appear to stay much more grounded. So what this means coming into this week's talks with Trump and Xi is that Chinese are in a very, very strong position, and Trump has no trump cards to play.
The other point that it doesn't seem that Donald Trump is getting it is these countries, the relationship or partnership, whatever we can call it, between Russia and China, between China and Iran, Iran and Russia, they don't interfere in the internal affairs or in what is important for their security. They don't dictate, they don't force each other, they cooperate with each other. This is the whole point, in my opinion, with the case of the partnership or relationship between these countries. And the Trump administration doesn't seem to get it. That's why they may ask, I would say, I don't know what is your understanding of this visit of China and what he's going to ask.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Whatever he asks, he's got very little leverage. Maybe he wants to see if he can get China to pressure Iran to back off and to stop, and China's not going to do that. I think the U.S. delegation is operating on the assumption that because China is on paper a major importer of oil, that it's under more pressure than the United States with respect to that shortage, and therefore we'll be looking for a way out. But I put up a piece at sonar21.com last night that lays out, and it's based upon a video done by Kevin Walmsley, who he lives in China. He's actually from the area where I live in Florida, it's Sarasota. And he walks through in detail that actually China is not vulnerable in the way that the West thinks. They're just the opposite. They have a much more stable, predictable path forward. And this is where the Western experts consistently overestimate China's fragility and underestimate China's resiliency. And we're going to see that this week, where Trump thinks he's got some pressure, can leverage China. Except let's look at what China's doing. Not only does it have the top 4 banks in the world, but it's starting to unload U.S. treasuries. It's not buying them, it's getting rid of them, and it's buying up gold and silver. It's setting up an alternative payment system to SWIFT called CIPS, Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. So, and China's reaching out to establish commercial relations with countries around the world, whereas the United States is doing all in its power to try to damage China. Again, if I'm the Chinese, I'm not sure I'd take the meeting with Trump. I'd tell him just go pound sand, because everything that the Trump administration has done has been involving sanctions against China or against different Chinese companies. It's not, we're not sending them a thank you note for anything. And we saw how that backfired early on in the, a year ago with the trade sanctions, the tariffs, that Chinese said, okay, we'll stop buying U.S. soybeans. The soybean market in the United States basically crashed. And because they said, well, we'll buy from Brazil. Brazil makes plenty of soybeans. Exactly what happened. So, Trump's actions hurt American farmers, didn't protect them, and made them more vulnerable. So I see, China knows how to play that game. They are much, much smarter at it than the United States is.
Yeah, he's putting a lot of pressure on the agricultural sector of the United States, not only with the tariffs, Larry, as you've just mentioned, with this case of the Strait of Hormuz. We know how is that influencing the fertilizers?
Mhm.
And do you think, Larry, that the case of the Strait of Hormuz somehow in the mind of the Trump administration is manageable by coordinating or so cooperating or trying to convince the Chinese government together with Europeans? Because on both sides, because I don't know if you heard that United Kingdom, it was reported by Fox News, United Kingdom together with France, they're sending aircraft carrier to the Middle East. Charles de Gaulle is there in the Red Sea,
Yeah.
by the way, they said.
Yeah,
But Macron said, no, we're not going to be there. And I don't trust Macron, whatever he says. But
yeah. So what? Okay, they're sending their aircraft carrier. What's it going to do? I mean, really, it's what can it do? Well, it's got to stay far enough offshore that it doesn't get blown out of the water. Number one, if the Europeans start launching strikes on Iranian positions in and around that Strait of Hormuz, Iran then Europe now becomes part and parcel of that war, and they'll further, Europe is the next domino to fall after Asia. Asia's starting to fall, and then it's going to be Europe will be next on the chopping block because it's going to be ravaged by the dramatic rise in the price of oil and price of gas and diesel fuel and aviation fuel.
Iran and IRGC said yesterday that they're going to hit every time the United States hits these tankers in the Strait of Hormuz or in the Persian Gulf or outside of the Persian Gulf, they're going to hit American bases together with American warships.
Right.
And how do you see the escalation? Is that going to, it seems Donald Trump he wants to go to China, and whenever he's going to be, in my opinion, it seems that he's going to get back on Friday, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yeah. So let's see. Right now, it is like where I'm at, it's 10:30. So in China, it's 10:30, 11:30 at night on the 11th. So in a couple hours, it's going to be the 12th. Donald Trump is going to have to leave. I don't know if he departs today for China or because, you figure, well, what is it, about 16-hour flight, 16-hour flight to Beijing. So let's see, 12 to tonight. Yeah, so if he leaves tonight or maybe first thing tomorrow morning on the 12th, but to get in there, he's there for the 13th, the 14th, and then as you said, he comes home on the 15th. So we're looking at while he is heading to China, I don't think you're going to see any dramatic military moves by the United States against Iran. There's not going to be a new spate of bombings or missile attacks or anything like that. They're trying to keep it contained. And I think Iran is content to sit back and not initiate an attack right now. In fact, I think they were asked by China to not retaliate. When the United States hit the Russian ships or the Iranian ships late last week, Iran very well. I expected Iran was going to retaliate, and they didn't. Now you say they didn't because they were afraid, or they didn't because they didn't have the capability. No, I think they didn't because they'd been asked by China, let's keep this under control, because China and Russia, I think they're making some significant progress on creating a new security architecture for the Persian Gulf, one that will put Saudis and Qataris in concert with Iran in a mutually beneficial collaborative effort, as opposed to this bifurcated conflict-based model that the United States has imposed. The U.S. model is, the security structure erected under the U.S. direction is being destroyed. It's coming down. So now what we're looking at is this new security architecture that the Chinese and Russians are actively working to create.
Larry, Wall Street Journal reported that Donald Trump going to be back. He's going to leave China on Friday. So on Friday, he's going to leave. And then I think next weekend, we're going to have on Saturday and Sunday, we're going to have the new round of war, if that's the plan.
Yeah. Well, is he leaving? So is he leaving Beijing on Friday, Beijing
on
time?
Friday, yeah.
Or is he leaving Friday U.S. time?
No,
You understand what I mean?
No, the president will land in Beijing on Wednesday and on May 13th and leave on Friday. He's gonna leave China on Friday.
So if he lands in Beijing on the 13th, so tomorrow, Tuesday, in the United States at 6 p.m. Eastern time, that is 6 a.m. on the 13th in China. You see what I'm saying? So the time, taking the time difference. So if he departs China on Friday, the 15th, then he could actually be departing late Thursday. He will get back to the United States on Friday.
Saturday. Yeah.
Yeah. So he'll get back to the United States on Friday, not Saturday. Yeah. But the odd thing, so he'll leave here on Tuesday to arrive there on Wednesday. And so I suspect if he goes out first thing tomorrow morning, then he'll be getting into China somewhere like 9 a.m. on Wednesday morning Chinese time. Have I confused you?
No. That's right, because the time difference between us and China is something like 11 hours. That's why they're ahead of us.
Yeah, it depends on which part of the country. Like they've got.
I'm talking about Beijing, basically.
I think China covers what, 3 time zones or 4?
Yeah, something like that. But Beijing have something between me and Beijing, which is in Brazil, because we have 1 hour ahead of you, and between you in Florida and it's east coast of the United States and Beijing is going to be 12 hours of difference.
Right.
No. And I think, by the way, we're going to have it on Saturday or Sunday if they start to do something.
Yeah, they could wait. Again, we can't rule out that he may get some news and a threat. The Chinese may make it clear to him if you renew conflict with Iran, you're going to be fighting us. So there's depends on what messages are delivered. There are some that argue that China doesn't care at all about Iran. It's just, we'll cut it loose in a heartbeat. Boy, they couldn't be more wrong. Iran figures in an important role in the future of China's economic growth. It's another important crossroads for trade, both overland and via railroad, as well as its access to the Indian Ocean.
Did you see the article, Larry, in New York Times? They finally discovered that Iran has the Caspian Sea. They can use it.
Yeah, somebody looked at a map. Hey, what's that? Yeah, that's why it's so ridiculous listening to the Trump folks, thinking that this blockade, boy, we got Iran bottled up. There's no way they can't. They're cut off. They're isolated. They're not going to get any more trade. And meanwhile, Russia can supply food, whatever material that Iran needs through the Caspian. The Chinese provide it through the railroad line that runs through Tashkent. And the Pakistanis provided over seven overland routes out of Pakistan. It's just, it's just an indictment of the incompetence of the Trump administration.
Larry, Iranian, from the reports on the part of Iranians, it seems that they have somehow, they know the way to saturate the air defense system of these destroyers.
Mhm.
They're using in the Persian Gulf, by the way, to fight against Iran with this blockade. The
Right.
main means of this blockade are these destroyers that they're using, and it seems that Iran has managed to saturate their air defense system, and then they can hit the target, the destroyer.
Yeah, I don't know how the vertical launch system on the destroyers works. And what I mean by that, I don't know if it's capable. So you got like 45, well, let's say you got 50 missiles forward and then 40 missiles in the back of the ship. And, can they fire them all at once? I mean, at an incoming target, or do they have to fire them one consecutively? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I suspect it's more the latter than the former. So that means with the drone swarm, you're going to hit some, but not all. And I think the Iranians actually have hit U.S. naval vessels and have damaged them, which is, I think, one other reason why the United States is itself backed off from doing anything too provocative in the Strait of Hormuz.
Netanyahu, in 60 Minutes, in his interview, said that we need to grab and snatch the Iranian nuclear, the enriched uranium in Iran.
Yeah.
At more than 60% enriched uranium in it. And he was asked if he means that militarily they can do it, or he's thinking of the other way. He didn't mention, but it seems to me that he really feels that they can go underground to grab the enriched uranium in Iran. I don't know what is happening in their mind, because he had the same sort of strategy with the so-called regime change in Iran, which is, I think, and just imagine how can they find enriched uranium in Iran and just.
Well, again, I think there's a lot based upon assumption in the planning for this. Assumption number one is that Iran has consolidated all of the 60% enriched uranium at one location. If I was a military planner, I wouldn't do that. I'd spread it out. I'd get it located in different places. Second, the assumption that Iran has not stepped up security at those sites to detect both inbound attacks and then to resist an attack. I know firsthand from an exercise I worked on, helped write, and then execute from 20 years ago that entailed sending a U.S. Special Operations Forces team into Iran to attack a particular nuclear site. It was called a hardened, deeply buried target, HDBT. And under that scenario, Iran didn't know we were coming, so we had the element of surprise. But even then, it turned out to be, let's call it, a very, very difficult mission, if not a mission impossible. And now that was then where they didn't know, with that scenario, they didn't know we were coming. Now we're looking at one where we've announced it, or at least that's our intention. So I don't think that the Iranian general staff, the IRGC, that they're sitting around ignoring that. I think instead they've taken measures to both bolster security at those sites.
Yeah. He said, Larry, that I think the mission, the war on Iran, accomplished a great deal. Then he mentions that they couldn't, grab the enriched uranium in Iran, but he says that there are still enrichment sites that need to be dismantled. He's talking about these nuclear facilities and all of that to be dismantled. I don't know what would and who could do that.
Mm-hmm.
And if they couldn't do it by attacking Iran. And the other point is that there is still proxies that Iran supports. He's talking about Hezbollah, Hamas, and Yemenis.
Mhm.
And he says they're still there. An Iranian ballistic missile program, he says, is still intact, and we have to do something about it. The guy is just somehow, he accomplished a lot. On the other hand, he has the same sort of problems that he had before this war started.
Yeah.
And
Well, go ahead. Sorry.
what would be the strategy? What would be the move? Because it's getting so boring, in my opinion, if Donald Trump tries to continue with this sort of plan on the part of Israelis.
Well, what we can come up with logically is not going to be put into place practically. The logic would suggest that the only way to end this fighting is for Israel to concede that the Palestinians deserve a state, a nation, an independent country that is full sovereignty over its people, over its territory, over its resources, and that Israel must get out, must abandon that. Israel's not going to do that. Israel's going to, they are locked into a mindset about their country that doesn't have any room for a Palestinian state. So this conflict is going to continue until such time as Israel is no longer capable of sustaining the fight, or the Palestinians are no longer capable of sustaining the fight. What I think the likely outcome is that Israel will fail. And the combination of it's increasingly alienated its support within the United States, and the recent attacks on Christianity and Christians in both Israel and in Lebanon is turning more and more Christians in the United States against Israel. They see it as just a vicious genocidal state. And then to that extent, how many members of Congress will continue to support sending billions of dollars to Israel? That's going to get cut back. So Israel really could be on the outs. And you've got Alistair Crook just recently published, his wife. What they do is Ashlyn goes in and she reads the Hebrew press and then reprints what is being said in these articles. And it's stunning what has been said of late, that the Israelis have lost their way, and that their attempt to stay in this constant state of war is destroying the country.
Yeah. And the situation in southern part of Lebanon is getting much more complicated for Israelis, as we've seen the latest footage of Hezbollah showing that, hey, they were able to hit, the Iron Dome battery. Here is, Larry, the footage that Hezbollah published. Yeah, that was the end of it.
Yeah.
And they're getting better and better, I think. And as time goes by, I don't know how Israel is going to be able, in terms of the casualties they're experiencing right now. It's unbelievable. We haven't seen this level of casualties on the part of Israelis, because when you go to the southern part of Lebanon, you have to defend your forces. When you are not able to protect them, then they're gonna hit your forces, not only your forces, but also the air defense system you have, as we call it, the Iron Dome. I think the only viable defense system they have right now is the Iron Dome, because we know the shortage on the part of the Patriot system and the THAAD system.
Well, even that doesn't work. We've seen because in that case, if the Iron Dome was so great, why didn't it shoot down that drone? It failed. So this, let me just read a couple of quotes to you from this piece that Alistair sent out. Senior military commentator Alon Ben David on the moral and disciplinary breakdown permeating the IDF, the near total dysfunction of public systems, and Israel's moral breakdown. This IDF chief, Zamir, will be required to return the IDF to the fundamentals of order, values, and discipline in a society that's breaking away from all of its norms. Then an article by a major Yitzhak Brick called Illusions of Victory. Israel's political and military echelons lied. Iranian ballistic missiles were not intercepted at all. Sometimes David Sling missiles were launched just to create the appearance of an interception attempt. Then retired Colonel Eldad Shavit, he taught Trump has already tried to sell the American public and the world the image of victory against Iran. However, it has repeatedly become clear that this narrative is unfounded. And then finally, the comment on how the drones are changing the nature of the war, something that Israel is completely unprepared for, despite having watched for the last 4 years what's been going on in Ukraine. So Israel is in trouble, and maybe there's a sort of a metaphor at work here, because here is Bibi Netanyahu. His appearance on 60 Minutes, he looks terrible. He's losing weight. He's becoming more gaunt. He's not the fat body he once was, but that's attributable to the fact that he has prostate cancer, and the cancer's eating away at him. So he may not be alive by the end of this year, which is they'll at least change the political dynamics inside Israel. I'm not sure it'll convince the Israelis to give up their quest to destroy Iran, destroy Hezbollah, destroy Hamas.
Yeah, but Israelis have new methods, Larry, to protect their soldiers in Lebanon. Here is one of them. They're deploying mannequins in this southern part of Lebanon.
Scarecrows.
Larry, I think we all remember that Israel, started attacking, or advancing in the southern part of Lebanon because of the problem they had in the northern part of Israel.
Yeah.
Has that problem resolved, or are they continuing with the same sort of problem?
No, I think Israel will be compelled to withdraw their forces from southern Lebanon in the next couple of weeks. Because as you rightly point out, they are taking so many casualties now from these drones. In previous incursion into southern Lebanon back in 2006, Israel didn't face off against drones. They had to worry about RPGs being fired at them and some crude missiles. But now it's a game changer what they're up against. So, and it's inflicting severe, significant equipment loss as well as significant casualties. And Israel's not big enough to sustain casualties like this.
Donald Trump posted an attacking Barack Obama. He says Barack Hussein Obama because he feels that if he says that like this, he's somehow insulting the guy.
Yeah.
By putting Hussein in. But Larry, don't you think that the whole concept of making Muslims, demonizing Muslims around the world has changed? I think the tone is changing, not only in the United States, outside of the United States. And the people are witnessing what is the reality behind it. Why do we need to demonize a religion? And what do you make of it, particularly in the United States?
Well, again, it goes back to I'll call it a historical prejudice. It is widely believed, and it's perpetrated within the Christian community, that Muslims hate Christians, and that Muslims are they're sneaky. That they'll come tell you one thing, but they're going to do the exact opposite to you. And that's where, and so as a result, and this goes back to the rise of the Muslim, the emergence of Islam in the 8th century or 7th century, and then it spread throughout the region, culminating in the wars that took place in Europe, in Turkey, in Spain, that beating, if you will, beating back the Muslim advance. So they've always been portrayed in this way as violently opposed to Christianity, except when you actually get into the theology, it is the Muslims, and I'm excluding the Sunni, the Wahhabis, those extremists, the Deobandis, they are completely intolerant. But the vast majority of Islam is quite tolerant and celebrates Jesus as a prophet, and they celebrate the Mother Mary, his mother Mary, as a holy woman. Whereas the Jews, just the opposite. They don't see Jesus as anything. He's a nobody, and Mary's a whore. And so this notion that the one who really is violently opposed to Christianity are the Jews, or the Zionists. I think the Zionists is a better way to phrase it. But and that what this is leading to is this erosion of support for Israel in the United States. It's going to become a critical factor going forward. Israel's becoming more isolated, not less. And the willingness, a few years back for the Gulf Arabs to embrace something like the Abraham Accord. UAE may do that, but nobody else is going to go along.
Do you believe that, because the main point of talking about Obama and Obama administration, Donald Trump was putting out in his latest post, he was somehow saying that Obama sent a lot of money to Iran after that JCPOA. The problem right now for Donald Trump, in my opinion, is that he's not going to get something like JCPOA. And the situation for him, if he gets something with the negotiations with Iran, is going to be far worse than JCPOA. And he has to ratify that agreement in the Congress, which wasn't the case with the case of JCPOA.
Okay, let's be precise with language. Far worse for whom?
Yeah, for Donald Trump, for the position that he's...
It will be more beneficial for Iran. And I'd encourage all your both listeners and viewers to go look up JCPOA and read what was the actual substance of that agreement. It was pretty onerous on Iran. Iran, in a way, sort of desperately signed on to that because it was up against both China and Russia at the time were willing to back, continued sanctions on Iran. So Iran wanted to get out from under those sanctions. Yeah, so this goes back to the other point you made earlier. I don't see Iran eager to return to a JCPOA framework at all. They're going to assert that we're a sovereign nation. We have the right to enrich uranium as we see fit, but we will remain signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we will continue to, and we'll set up a regimen that IAEA inspectors can come in periodically to determine that we're not building a nuke, and that we have no intention of building a nuke. That would be that'd be sort of the ideal agreement from Iran's standpoint, which the United States wouldn't accept, I don't think. But Iran's in a completely different mood now. There's, like I said, we're a sovereign nation, and we're not going to be treated with disrespect, which, I get that.
Yeah. Larry, there is a drastic or somehow significant division in GCC countries, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because based on what we've learned from the Iranian media and the calls between the two sides, on one side Iran, on the other side GCC countries, there were 6 phone calls between Iran and Saudi Arabia since the war started, 5 phone calls between Iran and Oman, with 2 meetings, by the way, 5 calls and 2 meetings by Oman. And in Qatar, it was 5 phone calls between Iran and Qatar. But when it comes to UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain, you see no phone calls between Iran and Qatar, or between Iran and Kuwait or Bahrain.
Yeah.
Just one single phone call between Iran and UAE. It was the vice president with the head of the Iranian parliament, Ghalibaf. It shows how different are these two sides in the Persian Gulf, within GCC countries. And how do you see with that architecture that you've just mentioned moments ago about Russia and China together with Iran are redefining or somehow reshaping the security structure of the region? And how do you see these players, Oman, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia? Because in my opinion, these are the most important players when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. Your understanding of that?
Well, that when you look at the real economics of it, probably the most, let's say, diversified commodity economy in the Gulf is that of Qatar, because Qatar dealt with both aluminum exports, they dealt with export of urea, they're the second largest producer in the world of helium. The biggest oil producer is Saudi Arabia. So I see Russia and China focusing first on those two, on the Saudis and Qataris, because Bahrain's so small, as is Kuwait, that they'll have no choice but to either try to go it on their own, which they can't, or accede to the fact, hey, these, Saudi and Qatar are leading the way to, closer working relationship with Iran. I see the Iranians actually being willing to be quite accommodating. That's going to leave UAE isolated, and Iran took the first step 3 days ago, when they hit Fujairah, the port, to basically close off further oil exports out of UAE. Apart from that, UAE is a fantasy. I liken it to I call it a cross between Disneyland and Las Vegas, because it is oriented towards the very wealthy. It's oriented towards sort of a party lifestyle. Hookers, were prevalent throughout. They went there to make their money, like did other members of East Asia or West Asia, to go get a job, serve all these wealthy Westerners that were flocking there. Yeah, this is this security architecture, as described it earlier. The original architecture was creating U.S. military presence to reassure the countries that as long as we're here, nobody's going to attack you. And hey, while we're here, why don't you spend a couple of $100 billion on buying some U.S. treasuries from us, and then you can also buy our military equipment. That'd be great. Well, it really wasn't a great relationship. It put those the Gulf Arabs in sort of a dependence condition. Then comes February 28th, and all of a sudden, the security guarantees from the West go right out the door. West can't protect them at all, and Iran makes that very clear. We can come in and bomb your critical bases and critical infrastructure. So that I think has caused some of these countries, particularly Qatar and Saudi Arabia, to step back and reassess. Do we really need to stay in this kind of tight relationship with Washington? Or here's Russia and China proposing something brand new, and there are financial incentives in it for us. Usually the relationship with the United States requires, hey, you got to give us money. You're not, let us not come in and say, let us show how we can both make money off of this deal, which is how China and Russia approach it.
Yeah. Here is what Donald Trump tweeted 14 years ago, Larry. gas prices are at crazy levels. Fire Obama. And
Yeah.
yeah, the guy is just, I don't know why does he need to attack, Obama to make his sort of position right now. But it's a common sort of attitude on his part. Whenever he's talking about the war in Ukraine, he's attacking Joe Biden. And when it comes to Iran, he's attacking Obama because he feels that it puts him in a better position to talk about the two conflicts.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem that anymore anybody believes that the war in Ukraine is, Joe Biden is gone. Nobody's talking about Joe Biden anymore.
Mm-hmm.
President of the United States is Donald Trump, who didn't end the conflict in Ukraine, started a new war in the Middle East. He is badly trapped, Larry. I don't know what would be his, sort of understanding as time goes by, but I don't see Donald Trump getting better or his position getting better. He's sinking deeper.
Well, yeah, he's becoming more erratic. And I think this trip to China is going to be actually, he's hoping they can come out and declare a great victory. I don't see it happening, but we'll see. If he comes out of that and then re-ups the bombings on the renewed attack on Iran, then this war is going to enter another phase that's going to be very, very destructive for both Israel and the United States, and very also damaging to the global economy, making things worse, not better. They're already bad. We haven't seen the full effects that are going to come to pass. So, this is Trump is not in control. That's the best way to look at it. He thinks he is, but he's lost the agenda.
Larry, the behavior of France is somehow strange. Whenever it comes to
wait. Can you give me a situation where the behavior of France has been normal and not strange? Come on, dude.
It's
France is being France. Okay. Vive la France. Sorry.
Yeah, but you remember with the case of Ukraine, they said if they could achieve some sort of agreement, they're going to put their troops in Ukraine.
Yeah, how's that working out?
And they're saying the same thing, by the way.
Yeah.
If the war ends in the Middle East, they're going to send their aircraft carrier to the Middle East to just protect the peace.
Yeah,
why do they need?
Well, I was just asking, what exactly are you going to do? Are you going to sell into the Strait of Hormuz so the Iranians can blow the hell out of your ship? Well, that'll send a message. Or they're going to send, you send the aircraft carrier, so you got combat aircraft on board the plane that's going to fly out and attack Iranian positions. Okay, then you've now expanded the war. And also you got to figure out how are you going to refuel all those aircraft. I guess they'll use the NATO KC-135s as one possible method to offset, trying to provide their own. Yeah, no, this is, again, let's step back and say, what is the purpose? What's the goal? Oh, we want to open the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, explain to me how you do that when to ultimately open the Strait of Hormuz, you have to eliminate the potential of strikes by short-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles and drones, which are launched from the interior of Iran. They're not out there on the coast. Iran, they do have defenses there on the coast. I'm not saying they don't. And they have robust defenses on the coast that in and of themselves are difficult enough to defeat. But let's assume that you can defeat those, what do you do about this stuff, these launch sites that are, 100, 200 miles inside Iran?
What do we know about, Larry, the ammunition or the missiles and interceptors that Europe is producing for Israel?
They're producing for Israel? With what?
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
don't know. With Iron Dome, do they produce some sort of missiles for the Iron Dome, for the THAAD, Patriot? Are they able to produce that?
No, I don't think so. And I'm not sure that they got access to the rare earth minerals that are essential for those productions anyway. Yeah, no, Europe's a nobody now. We've watched, they still exist on paper. They still have great historical sites to visit. But they used to be the agenda setter in the 19th century. They were leading in the realm of scientific investigations and in industrializations, producing products. They were stealing great wealth from their colonies around the world. But then comes World War I. That destroys a generation of men and begins the unraveling of the various colonial empires, not just with the Brits, but with the French, with the Germans, with the Dutch. And then World War II sort of seals the fate. And so since then, they're all trying to be relevant. And, the operation that the Brits mounted in, was it 82, 81 at the Falklands, they couldn't do that today. They don't have the ability. So they've lost out on that front. They militarily, they really have nothing to offer. They're no longer a leading source of scientific ideas and research. Their strength as a financial capital, that's eroded as well. There's a lot of focus. This guy Tom Luongo's always big about, City of London, City of London, City of London, and you know what? Look at the City of London. HSBC is the only bank in the top 10, and it's like number 8 or 9. So it's not the enormous player that everybody's got to pay attention to. And the Chinese banks are going in a whole different direction, again, outside the Western model. So again, Europe is not only a shadow of its former self. It's really, I would argue, it's no longer relevant. It can be a nuisance and it can make threats, but in terms of actual having industrial production to produce anything for Israel, good luck with that.
Yeah. Just before wrapping up, Larry, Netanyahu said they want to be independent. They don't need the United States. They're in the process of getting independent from the United States. They don't need the United States to send them money or anything, any sort of help.
Yeah.
But when he was asked what is the timeline of that, he said in the next decade.
Yeah.
My God. It means that it never happens.
Yeah, he ought to sing the song from Annie. Tomorrow, I love you. Yeah, it's tomorrow. That's going to come to pass. Good luck. Don't hold your breath. Yeah, the U.S.-Israeli relationship, it's going in the opposite direction right now. Growing number of Americans are going, what? Why are they holding us hostage? And Netanyahu makes no bones about it, particularly when he's talking only in Hebrew, thinks the Americans don't understand, and most don't. But when they get the translation, they go, did he really say that? Yes, he did. So this is, we haven't seen the end of this. The markets keep looking for a turnaround. There's a hope that the light's at the end of the tunnel. Nope. This war is going to go, this situation, closure of the strait, it's going to go on for quite some time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today.
Start the week off on such a cheery note, right? All right. You keep up the guy. I'm amazed. You do your university work and then you do this amazing load of
و is very renowned for making accurate predictions. Some of them have been the re-election of Trump, Vance as his pick for vice president, and very relevant for today, also predicting that the US would go to war with Iran. Now, the war with Iran, I thought, was a very interesting prediction of yours, because on so many levels, it doesn't make a lot of sense that the US would do this, because it seems to be such a huge mess. It's very difficult to defeat the Iranians militarily, and there's no good way for them to, declare victory and go home. So I thought a good place to start would be, ask you why. Well, how did you see, or why did you correctly predict that the United States would attack Iran?
Right. So I believe that the best evidence that the United States would eventually attack Iran is that in January 2020, Trump ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who was the Iranian envoy to the Middle East. He was basically the Iranian ambassador to the proxies, right? Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis. So killing an ambassador is basically a declaration of war. So I felt that if Trump had won re-election in 2020, then he would most certainly went to war against Iran. And I didn't know why he wanted to go to war against Iran. I had many hypotheses, but I was fairly certain that if he had won re-election, then he would have declared war against Iran.
Yeah, and how do you see this war now developing, though? Because there's if you would assess it, one of the things that makes it complicated is that it's so many actors involved with their different interests. Of course, at the heart of it, one can say it's the U.S. Iranian war, which is often referred to. But of course, Israel is a key participant. The Iranians have several close regional allies, and of course, you have the great powers of Russia and China. So how do you see this war playing out?
Right. So I think in the first month of this war, the United States was focused on decapitation, basically trying to kill as much of the Iranian leadership as possible, hoping that that would force political settlement, where the Iranians would surrender and the Americans can basically enforce regime change. The Iranians have proven to be much more resilient, much more creative, much more resourceful than the Americans gave them credit for. And so now the Americans have moved to phase two of the war, which is essentially a war of attrition, economic strangulation, where they're trying to destroy Iran's capacity to finance this war, mainly by destroying Iran's capacity to export oil to China, as well as to control the Strait of Hormuz. That's why Trump has declared a naval blockade against the Strait of Hormuz. And so I think that this is where the war is going to go. It's going to be a slow war that's going to be out of the headlines. Very much like what happened in Gaza, really, where maybe for the first few weeks, the entire world was disgusted by what the Israelis were doing, but they declared a ceasefire, and then slowly the attention of the world shifted elsewhere. And that's what Trump's, I think, intends to do with Iran, where he's going to try to apply as much military, diplomatic, political, and economic pressure as possible to force political settlement and trying to divert people's attention away from the war. Quite honestly, I don't think there is an off-ramp for Trump because the consequences of this war are just so vast. So, for example, if you look at the GCC nations, the UAE has suffered a great deal in this war. They cannot afford for Iran to emerge the victor in this war and to control the Strait of Hormuz. So the UAE is essentially all in defeating Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran have a rivalry going back decades, where both are vying for supremacy in the Islamic world. And so Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a long-term threat as well. So even though Saudi Arabia has been trying to promote a diplomatic solution, their best interest is to also see a defeated Iran. Bahrain is right now under a lot of threat because most of the population is Shia Muslim, and their leadership is Sunni, and the leadership is not very popular there. And the Iranians are very much intent on promoting revolutions across the Islamic world. So these three nations, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain, possibly also Kuwait as well, they want to see this war fought to the end. The Iranians don't want to go back to the status quo where they were sanctioned. They now have control of the Strait of Hormuz. They want economic relief. They see the Strait of Hormuz as their main leverage point against the Americans. So they also want to see this war fought to the end. The Americans are stuck because of the petrodollar, where if they leave, basically these GCC nations would start trading in multiple currencies, including Chinese yuan, including in gold. And so this would collapse the American economy because they're so dependent on investment from the GCC nations. The GCC has trillions invested in America, and they're forced to repatriate these trillions back into the GCC in order to pay reparations to the Iranians. Then this would spell catastrophe for the American economy, especially the AI sector. Israel is intent on the Greater Israel Project, and they see this as an opportunity to redraw the map of the Middle East in order to achieve the Greater Israel Project. Israel wants this war to continue for as long as possible because they believe that the Arabs and the Iranians would destroy each other in the process. And when the smoke clears, they would have achieved the Greater Israel Project. So essentially in the Middle East, there are too many powerful individuals who want to see this war fought to the end, and no one can really countenance a defeat.
Yeah, no, I agree. It doesn't appear to be any any pathway to to a political settlement which would be acceptable to both sides. But in terms of the interest of the U.S. to reduce the intensity of this war, as you said, just to max pressure on, blockading its ports, trying to suffocate its economy, it's not clear to me why the Iranians would accept playing this game, though, to allow the Americans to fight this war on their premises, on their conditions. So wouldn't the Iranians have an interest to essentially put down their foot and open up this blockade by hitting back hard at the U.S. bases of the region, shutting down the Red Sea, or whatever else they can do in order to prevent the U.S. from, going to this slow suffocation of Iran and calling it peace?
Right. So I completely agree with your analysis. I think that the Iranians, for the first month, were winning this war. They were proactive. They had the initiative. They were basically controlling the tempo of the war. With a ceasefire, this dynamic has completely changed. Now the Americans actually are more proactive. I would say the Americans are now dominant, actually, in that region. And I think that why a ceasefire was negotiated was that China applied a lot of pressure on Iran for the ceasefire. The GCC nation states trade a lot with China, and in mid-April, the UAE leader, MBZ, visited China on a state visit and basically told the Chinese, listen, we're in a lot of trouble. And the reality is that China trades with everyone. So yes, they get a lot of oil from Iran, but they actually get more LNG from Qatar. So the Chinese statecraft is trying to focus on win-win global peace. And so China doesn't really care how this war started. It doesn't really care who started this war. It just wants this war to end. And China right now is very focused on opening the Strait of Hormuz. So I think the Chinese applied a lot to pressure through Pakistan. Pakistan was a front man, but China was working behind the scenes. And so I think it was only because of Chinese involvement and Chinese security guarantees that the Iranians agreed to a ceasefire. But this ceasefire, and this is really important for people to understand, is it's caused actually a rift between the political leadership and the military leadership. The political leadership in Tehran wants to see a negotiated political settlement as soon as possible because they're really afraid that if this war goes on for too long, the Iranian economy would collapse, Iran will be isolated diplomatically, and the population may revolt against the government. The military leadership under the IRGC, they want to see this thing fought to the bitter end because the Americans killed their leader, Qasem Soleimani, and they killed their spiritual leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei. So now there's this rift between the political and the military leaderships, and I think this could have tremendous consequences as this war continues.
Well, how do you see a likely pathway here to a world war? Or I talk to people who argue that we might already be in this world war, given all the great powers being involved in this kind of military hostilities. But well, for example, for the United States, it's not able to put an effective blockade on the Iranian ports, given that it's too far from the coastline, too wide the region has to cover with too few assets, not enough supply and support. But for example, at some point, the Americans would get the idea, given that most of the Iranian energy tankers, they're heading towards China, why not just cut them all off at the Strait of Malacca or one of these choke points, which the U.S. has traditionally looked at to destroy the Chinese economy. So and also, of course, you see now Russia, at least reportedly, providing more and more support for Iran, not just intelligence, but weaponry. Again, it's hard to know exactly what's being done due to the fog of war here, but do you see a pathway into a world war now?
Forget the dubious investment tips. With IG, you can enjoy up-to-date insights, analysis, and tools. IG, trade, invest, progress.
I tried a ton of AI work tools. Then I tried Monday.com. Game over. Monday.
I think we're already in World War III. It's just like the way we understand war is different in the 21st century than in the 20th century. So 19th century war was essentially about armies clashing on the battlefield. Like World War I was just trench warfare. And it was easy to see as war because these armies were just killing each other on the trenches. World War II was about destroying the state's capacity to fight the war. So basically targeting civilian populations. So for example, the fire bombings of Germany and Japan were what allowed the Allies to win the war in the end. It's something that's not really discussed, but the fire bombings were really destructive, killed a lot of civilians, basically can destroy the state's capacity to manufacture the weapons necessary to fight a war. And that's how the Allies won. So that's the 20th century warfare. 21st century warfare is different in that it's ultimately about economic strangulation and forcing your opponent to submit and causing domestic unrest. And I think World War III, the two main combatants are America and Russia. And already we're seeing this massive war in the oceans where American ships are trying to target and board, basically seize Russian shuttle fleet tankers. These are just acts of piracy. And the Americans have already, I believe, seized two Russian oil tankers. And so I believe that in the future, what's going to happen is that the Russians are going to arm and militarize the shuttle fleet. And so we should see a massive war in the oceans in the next few years. So this war is primarily economically between Russia and America. Another aspect of this war is sabotage, right? So we're seeing these Ukrainian drones striking at Russian oil refineries. We're seeing oil refineries being destroyed all around the world. So basically, it's economic warfare, it's economic strangulation. Now, China is key to this because the American strategy vis-a-vis China is different from the American strategy vis-a-vis Russia. So America just wants to destroy Russia economically. But actually, China is very important for America to maintain its debt financing. So right now, America has about $39 trillion in debt. And it needs China to continue to buy US treasuries. So America is trying to create a situation in which China is forced to buy US treasuries and allow America to maintain the Ponzi scheme. And so it doesn't want to destroy China economically, because if you destroy China economically, then China is just going to choose a nuclear option and offload all its US treasuries, causing a panic in the global economy. So what America wants to do is basically try to pressure China into an economic settlement. And so if you look at what happened in Venezuela, right? So on January 3rd, America kidnapped Maduro. And you can make the argument that the entire point of that was to signal to China that America controls the Western Hemisphere. This is something called the Monroe Doctrine, or the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And China has invested trillions of dollars into South American infrastructure, ports, refineries, railways, because China needs the food, resources, and energy from South America. So what Trump is trying to say to China is that if you want to buy anything in North America, you have to go through us. We will collect a tax. And the tax is for you to open up your financial market and for us to be able to sell stable coins. to your population. Okay, so stable coins are just digital currency backed by U.S. treasuries. So the entire strategy is institutions buy U.S. treasuries, and then individuals can buy U.S. stable coins. And so the United States is invested in having the Chinese economy do well, and then forcing the Chinese to buy more U.S. treasuries and more U.S. dollars in order to sustain the U.S. economy. And that's the strategy for the Americans going into into the next 5 years. And that's why Trump is actually visiting Beijing in a couple of days. It's a 3-day visit, and I think that they're going to prepare the groundwork for a grand bargain between China and the United States. And there'll be 3 areas to look out for, I think, in these negotiations. And these negotiations will take over the course of the next year, okay? The first is trade. And again, I think what's going to happen is that China will agree to buy more resources from the Western Hemisphere, specifically LNG from America, in order to sustain its manufacturing sector. Okay, that's the first thing, the trade. Second is that second issue is Taiwan, where in order to better facilitate trade between the United States and China, Trump is going to declare that Trump is going to declare that Taiwan and China are the same political entity. He's going to refute Taiwanese independence. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is that I think you'll see massive cooperation in AI, where both nations agree that AI is the future, and they will agree to share technology and cooperation in developing AI that is safe and effective for the entire human race. So I think that when Trump visits Beijing, the signal will be given that there'll be a rapprochement between the United States and China. And again, the entire goal of the United States, and I can't say this clearly enough, the entire goal of the United States is to turn China into an economic vassal of the American empire.
If you have tried multiple oral antidepressants and they haven't worked,
yeah, but surely China must see, the path they're on, that the U.S. isn't really seeking peaceful coexistence, but instead, that is as two equals in a multipolar system, that it's seeking to I guess, essentially restore its dominance. But how do you make sense of how the Europeans fit into this? Because at the moment it looks as if they're preparing themselves for buying energy from Americas, and then America can essentially sell its energy to the Europeans while importing cheaper energy, for example, from Russia. I mean, is this also essentially setting up the Europeans as vassals? Because economically it appears to be going that direction.
Well, unfortunately, the European leadership has already been vassalized, right? So you go back to 2022, when the war between Ukraine and Russia first started. The Europeans froze $200 billion of Russian assets at the bequest of the Americans. This destroyed the legitimacy, credibility of the European banking system. The Europeans stopped buying Russian energy, and this destroyed the European economy. The Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed, and the Europeans knew who did it. Everyone knows who did it, but they insisted it was the Russians who did it. So in many respects, the Europeans have already been vassalized. And now the Europeans are already discussing drafting men to go fight in Ukraine. If the Europeans did not provide the financing and the political support to Ukrainians, this war would have been over 2 years ago. So unfortunately, the European leadership has already been vassalized. And this is going to create a lot of discontent within the European population. We're already seeing that with the rise of the AfD in Germany.
Yeah, no, it's. I think the public is slowly awakening that their leaders are not serving them anymore. You made some other predictions, though. You argued that the U.S. would likely send in ground troops against Iran. I've heard this from many others as well, but it also is one of those things that appear to defy logic, because Iran seems to be built up like a fortress with its mountainous regions. It's blocked by international waterways, and and yeah, of course, a very powerful, large population. Well, powerful in terms of having good high industrial capacity, producing cheap weaponry, which can be decentralized and not easy to be reduced. Also, yeah. So I'm wondering how do you see the logic of ground troops here?
Right. So the reason why I use ground troops is that it's not sustainable to use airframes in a war of attrition. They cost too much, they're too easy to shoot down, and eventually you will have wear and tear. And we're already seeing that where there is now friendly fire, there are a lot of accidents, and a lot of American planes are being shot down. These are $90 million planes, $100 million planes. You can't afford to fight a war of attrition in the air for too long. So what you do is you send in ground troops because they're cheaper and they're more cost effective. And what you do, you have two goals. The first goal is to secure the Iranian coastline. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to deny Iran's capacity to collect tolls and to exert control over the Strait of Hormuz. And so you use ground troops in order to basically hunt down Iranian artillery, Iranian underground missile bases. And the second reason why you use ground troops is you want to set up forward operating bases within ethnic enclaves in Iran, primarily the the southeast of Iran by the Pakistani border. These are the Balochs, and then the northwest of Iran, and this is where the Kurds are based. What you're trying to do is you're trying to stir up ethnic tensions in Iran and force the IRGC to confront these ethnic groups on the ground, and so they'll be exposed to air power. And so you're forced to use ground troops if you want to continue this war. It's not sustainable otherwise.
And well, it seems one of the reasons why the Iranians can absorb a lot of pain is because they reasonably see this as an existential threat. It's a bit like the reason why the Russians and Ukrainians are willing to, accept so many sacrifices, because they both consider this, again, for good reasons, to be an existential threat. But for the United States, you would think that they have more limited appetite for casualties. So how do you see the U.S. Essentially being in a position to push this to continue this war, and because the ground troops would mean a lot of pain.
End the day with endless comfort. Sleep Number, to a good night's sleep.
You serve the public, we serve you. We're Tyler Technologies, the government technology partner trusted by.
Right. So what people don't appreciate is that the United States is in a lot of financial trouble. So right now, the United States has $39 trillion in debt. And so they're forced to spend $1 to $2 trillion in financing this debt, paying interest to this debt. And there are no good options here. If you default, what happens is that you cause private banks that are financing the US government right now, the Federal Reserve basically, to collapse, in which case, all these savings that these Americans have put into the banks are wiped out. So default is not an option. So your only option is war. And the idea of war is to force other parties to pay and absorb the US debt, right? So when you go into Iran, what you're trying to do is you're trying to cause economic strangulation throughout the world. The Europeans are very dependent on Middle East oil. If the Europeans cannot pay for Middle East oil, they're now forced to pay more for American oil, right? So American LNG costs 50 times more than Russian energy. And so what America wants to do is force the entire world to buy U.S. energy and resources from the Western Hemisphere, and the U.S. will finance this, meaning that the United States will lend the world the money to buy U.S. weapons and U.S. resources. This is very similar to the early 20th century, when because Europe was in World War II and World War I, America was able to sell its resources all around the world and make a lot of money for itself. And so what America is trying to do is it's trying to force the world to absorb the $39 trillion in debt. And you're right in that the Iranians are fighting very hard because it's their home and they don't want to lose their families. But the Americans are also forced to fight very hard as well, because the alternative is economic collapse, civil war, and possibly the collapse of the American state.
Yeah, well, it's you argue that we're already in World War III, but it's fought differently than the first two world wars. However, one of the big risks here is that the current conflicts now between the great powers can continue along the existing trajectory. I mean, the delusion of escalation control, that's something that worries me a lot. That is, that the Europeans think, for example, they can continue to attack Russian cities, and the Russians won't retaliate. They can, take block Russian ships. They won't do anything. Well, might be able to put to cut off China's access to energy, and they necessarily won't do anything. And of course, the U.S. can have an economic crisis tomorrow and begin. Things can easily spiral out of control. It just seems to me that the path we're currently on, it seems very temporary. Do you see I guess a clear path forward in terms of the great powers beginning to escalate against each other, because it doesn't seem sustainable in any way what's happening now?
Right. So I think the calculus is this. The calculus is that if you do nothing, you might have a situation like the 1848 revolutions, when all the monarchies in Europe in 1848 were at the precipice of being overthrown by popular rebellions. Okay, and if you do something, you might end up in World War I, where millions of people just died in the trenches, and it seemed as though the world was about to end. So if you're the elite in Europe and America, you would much prefer the World War I option as opposed to the 1848 option. And that's a stark choice facing the global elite right now. You either do nothing, and then your populations revolt against you because you're incompetent, you're greedy, you're corrupt, or you send them to die off in the trenches of Ukraine, to send them to die in the mountains of Iranian in order to reduce the political tension at home. And I know this is very blunt, and I know this is very stark, but at the end of the day, the elite have dug themselves a huge hole.
Yeah. Well, a key actor here, though, is Israel. We see again the ambitions being quite clear, but at the same time, they seem to have a lot of profound problems. They have very deep divisions in society, something that seems to border close to a civil war. You have this greater Israel initiative, which puts them at odds with their all of their neighbors almost. Their main protector is the United States, which is in relative decline. You have the emergence of new great powers in the region, which are less empathetic to Israel, and even the United States is losing. You see again quite a fascinating trend, which is that the standing of Israel, how Americans perceive it, it's in free fall. I haven't seen this in my lifetime, at least, the way the Americans are now turning a bit on Israel, at least the population. As you said, the elites or political establishment, they still, continue as nothing has happened. But where do you see Israel ending up here?
So unfortunately, Israel has become a death cult. It's very eschatological. It's only minority people, right? You have these religious extremists who've taken control over the Israel government, and they believe that what's happening in the Middle East will lead to the coming of Messiah. So as long as they stick together, and as long as they push history forward, they want to accelerate the process, then God will save them. So the calculus, it's very diabolical, it's very cynical. But what they believe is this: the world is headed towards collapse. The world is headed towards decline. And so there's going to be chaos throughout the world. And if Israel is able to accelerate this chaos, push this chaos forward, then what's going to happen is that, first of all, Israel is going to be better positioned than everyone else to take advantage of this chaos because Israel has initiative. But also, it's going to force all Jews around the world to unite behind the idea of Israel, because the world will rightfully see Israel as a chaos agent. But that's good for Israel, because if the Jewish people are united, if all the nation of Israel is united behind a common cause, then God will stand behind Israel and defeat the entire world. And unfortunately, that is very much a calculus of these religious fanatics in Israel today.
Yeah, I wanted to ask. I forgot. I wanted to ask another question about Europe as well, because one of the things that looks very concerning at the moment is the possibility of a direct Russia-Europe war, which would be, I guess, a significant component of a world war, simply because the Europeans, I think, they bet everything on this war. That is to use the Ukrainians to defeat Russia. But now they kind of this incrementalism, they got pulled in deeper and deeper, and now the situation they're in is now that Ukraine is faltering, they have to escalate, essentially have to get more involved, send more long-range missiles. They have to do more, intercept Russian ships, talking about putting a naval blockade on the Russians, all of these things to compensate for things going poorly on the battlefield. And this is happening at the same time that the Americans are signaling that, this is for you to fight. So again, if you want to fight the Russians, you fight with Ukrainians and Europeans. If you want to fight the Iranians, use the Arabs. If you want to fight the Chinese, use some of the frontline states in East Asia. But so you have the Europeans escalating, the Americans seemingly walking away and not being prepared to defend the Europeans. And while this is all happening, the Russians, the main pressure they're under is they have to restore their deterrence, because they let the Europeans and, NATO overall just walk all over them and give in every time. So if I would make a prediction, it looks as if the Russians are preparing to strike back, to retaliate, a bit like the Iranians, restore their deterrence. And the Americans very likely will then leave this to the Europeans. But the Europeans do not have that much fighting power, it seems. So where do you see this going?
Right. So you look at the National Defense Strategy of the United States, which was published in January of this year. It lays out a vision for the world. And right now, the Americans are actually implementing this vision. The vision is this: America retreats into Fortress North America, Greater North America, right? And that's why Trump has been aggressive towards Canada, Greenland, Mexico, Colombia, Honduras, Nicaragua, Cuba, right? Because it's all part of Greater North America. And then what's going to happen is that the American economy is going to focus more on manufacturing and resource extraction, okay? So the Pentagon has reached out to Ford and General Motors in Detroit and said that they would like these companies to manufacture more munitions and drones. And these companies are probably happy to do that because it's more profitable to make weapons than it is to make cars. Okay, so that's a vision for Greater North America. And in order to create markets for American weapons, what you do is you create divide and rule throughout the world, right? So imagine a situation where Russia is funding Europe in Europe. Japan is funding China in East Asia. Iran is fighting the GCC in Israel in the Middle East. Well, now the entire world now depends on American resources and American weapons in order to sustain these wars. And this would be of tremendous benefit to America. So America right now is trying to create the conditions where the world is in complete chaos, and America can just sit back in North America and profit, right? And that's why I think that when Trump goes to China in 2 days, it's going to be extremely conciliatory, where he makes a lot of generous offers to China, and China reciprocates. And so it seems as though there's now peace between China and the United States. But then what happens that Trump goes immediately to Japan and encourages Japan to militarize against the Chinese threat, right? So what's happened is that before, the conflict was between the United States and Russia in Europe, and then the United States basically subcontract this conflict to the Europeans, right? And now before, the conflict was between China and the United States and East Asia. What the Americans are going to do is subcontract this conflict to the Japanese and the South Koreans against China. So it's all part of this, diabolical, cynical strategy of the Americans to maintain their empire.
But a lot of this is premised on the ability to keep the wars essentially on the slow burner, not to get too intense. And I think that's one of the.
You don't pay big brand markups when you buy Aldi brand.
It's an Aldi thing. What if there was an emergency room in Galveston County, a leader in healthcare, where patients are treated with the same compassion and urgency that you have when an unexpected
Again, it goes back to this delusion I mentioned about the escalation control, because the war with Russia, I guess the benefit is that the NATO countries, to a large extent, allow them to manage the pace of this. That is, this slow, grinding war. And I think often the assumption in Europe is, if the Europeans would enter this war directly, it's, well, first they send a few soldiers to the rear, somewhere along, western parts of Ukraine to do other tasks, which would free up Ukrainians to go die on the front. But if this is not enough, they could always have some special forces somewhere close to the front, managing weapons more. And then, they could have a little bit on the front line just to tip the balance, just to make sure the front lines begin to freeze and do not move significantly. But the thing is, I can't imagine the way the Russians have been fighting the Ukrainians, that they would treat the Europeans the same way. The idea that, in Europe, they would simply be able to restrict the war to Ukrainian and Russian territory. It just seems as if this would escalate in a huge way very, very quickly.
I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. Like this plan of the Americans is cynical, and it's also going to end up being counter-effective. It's going to destroy their allies, and it may turn the entire world against America. But the reality is that America is desperate to maintain its empire, and it's willing to burn down the entire world in order to maintain its empire. So that's the situation we are in. I also point out that if you look at the battle lines in Ukraine, I believe the European special forces are already in the battle. So last year, it seemed as though the Russians had a major breakthrough, and it seemed as though the Ukrainian front lines were exhausted. They basically broke down, and now there's a certain like new energy to the Ukrainian front lines, and they're winning back territory. So I have to believe that European special forces are already on the ground in some capacity in Ukraine, and because of mission creep, we should expect an escalation. Look, and also the Ukrainians are striking at Russian oil refineries, and this is going to compel the Russians to hit the Ukrainians much harder. The Russians have been extremely methodical in their attacks against Ukrainians. They've not targeted Ukrainian power plants. They've not targeted critical civilian infrastructure, and now they will, because they appreciate that this war will now be between Europe and Russia, and it'll be fight to the bitter end.
So when the Europeans become the new Ukrainians, that is to fight to the last European, do you see the United States sitting this one out, or do you, or would they?
The entire U.S. strategy is for Europe to fight the Russians to last European, as you say, and they'll sit this out because they have absolutely no interest. All they want to do is cause as much conflict as in the world as possible, and then continue to sell weapons and resources to Europe, and they will finance it and thus force the world to absorb U.S. debt. It's very clear what's happening. Even the Europeans know what's happening, but unfortunately, the entire European leadership has been vassalized by the Americans, and the European leadership is very much afraid of their own population. These are bureaucrats who just want to maintain power. So it's going to basically take a popular revolt for policy to change in Europe.
Just the last question on this topic, though, is given that the Russians and Iranians now, I think Russians and Chinese, they kind of see that the U.S. push for peace in Ukraine, it seems a bit deceptive now. It wasn't a push for peace; it was outsourcing the war to the Europeans, and that a key target in Iran seems to be the Chinese. How do you think? To what extent do you think they will come in now and make sure that the Iranians are able to essentially push back against the Americans, that is to absorb the pain and strike back?
Right. So unfortunately, the Chinese tend to have a very short-term utilitarian approach to geopolitics. And so what we need to recognize is that the Chinese have strong economic relations with everyone in the Middle East, including Israel, including the GCC, including Iran. So they don't want to be put in a situation where they side with Iran and then they are forced into conflict with the GCC. The Chinese don't do things like that. They believe very much in balance and harmony. And so the Chinese have been applying a lot of pressure on the Iranians to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and to basically end this war as much as possible. Now, it's completely unfair because it's Americans and it's really to the aggressor. But unfortunately, you can't reason with bullies. You can't reason with thugs. So the Chinese are stuck trying to reason with the Iranians. And so the Chinese basically want this war to end as soon as possible and for global trade to resume as peacefully as possible. But unfortunately, the Chinese are not taking a long-term geopolitical approach to the situation in the Middle East. They don't really acknowledge the fact that the Americans are hell-bent on maintaining their empire. And in the long term, it's not really in the benefit of China to side with the Americans. But in the short term, and really only the Chinese care about the short term, the Chinese are stuck working with the Americans.
Try the new Chips Ahoy Chewy Chocolatey Churro Cookies.
In charging, physics creates paradoxes.
What is happening within the United States then? I've heard you argue that it's quite a strong possibility that Trump may seize a third term, that the U.S. might impose the draft again to get enough manpower into the army. How do you see this future for the United States? Because again, I think a key issue for the Americans is they often have this grand strategy in place, but they often lose sight of the societal component. That is, for example, in the beginning of the 90s, there is all these new trade agreements, which would give the Americans, will extend the intellectual property rights. It would give the Americans competitiveness in tech, in the finance, and essentially, the areas where there's high revenue and high dependence, while they, in return, outsourced their industries. So a bit like a modern version of repatriating repealing the Corn Laws, just to divide the International Division of Labor. But again, the impact on the United States was quite disastrous. Again, the whole idea that that is the Americans will, develop the iPhone and the Chinese can put it together. It didn't make much sense because what happened was the manufacturing base of the U.S. as this left, there was, you have massive social problems, which is what has caused a lot of this political, economic, and social instability. And at the same time, the Chinese essentially learned how to make that iPhone themselves. So now they don't have the lower parts of the global of the supply chains. They can't produce anything, and also they don't dominating the top tiers anymore of these global value chains. But it seems that they not yet again neglect that all these wars. I mean, if you don't shut down energies competition around the world, the Russians, the Venezuelans, the Iranians, you can go on. Yes, it can make greater dependence on the U.S., but it's going to create shockwaves, though, through American society, which will destabilize to a great extent. Sorry, it's a very long way of asking. How do you see the possibility of a Trump third term and draft, other ways of managing, I guess, a population which is also to some extent in a pre-revolutionary era?
Look, at the end of the day, the American empire is able to control Trump. And Trump is a chaos agent, but he is doing the bidding of the American empire, right? So everyone's attention is focused on Trump and think it's all Trump's stupidity that is leading to all this chaos around the world. But if you actually read the national security strategy, you just think about game theory and how the Americans benefit from all that's going on, everything Trump is doing makes sense. The issue with Trump, why Trump is important, is Trump is willing to do these things. Biden was supposed to do these things, but he didn't do these things because he was afraid of looking like a complete idiot. and he didn't want to be another Hitler, right? He didn't want to be the bad guy. And so it's actually very hard to find someone like Trump who's willing to be the bad guy, who's willing to be the scapegoat, and who's willing to act rashly without thought. So remember back 2003 during the war against Iraq, everyone knew it was about oil. Everyone knew it was about the American empire, and you had protests around the world against this act of aggression against Iraq. But now, in this blatant act of aggression against Iran, you don't have protests around the world. Everyone's focused on Trump and thinking that if Trump will be gone in 2 years' time, and then the world will return back to normal. So Trump is extremely useful for the purposes of American empire. That's why I think that he'll stick around, because the American empire needs certain things to happen, including a national draft. So the reality is that for the past 2 years, America has been trying to onshore manufacturing back from China, and it doesn't work. And there's a really good reason why it doesn't work, because the American population has become complacent. It's become lazy and corrupt. Think about all these American young people who are trying to make their fortunes trading cryptocurrency or gambling online, and spend all their time on OnlyFans. I mean, the empire has made America an extremely corrupt and lazy place where young people aren't able to contribute effectively to the economy. The problem isn't the lack of manufacturing jobs. There are lots of manufacturing jobs in America. The problem is you don't have young people in America who want to work these blue-collar jobs. They don't want to work for like $10 an hour. They much rather, gamble and try to make $1 million in a year. So you need a national draft, not to fight wars, but to discipline your population, to train your population to be much more compliant, to be much more desperate, and to have like real skills. That's the reason why you need a national draft.
Yeah, well, it's a bit benefit of democracy, I guess. That is, you can reduce violent opposition if people think they can change things at the ballot box. That is, they always assume in the United States that, well, once the opposition comes into power, because they're always speaking of peace, then then things will go back to normal. But you had this since Clinton, with all this interventionisms, and then Bush would come, George Bush. People forget this now, but during the debates, he was criticizing nation building. We don't do nation building. We're America. And then, of course, he had Afghanistan, Iraq. He took it to the extreme. Then you have Obama. He was going to introduce change. And again, more of the same. This was no difference. And Trump, he was peace president. Biden was going to let the grown-ups take over again, and he provoked a war with Russia. I mean, you can't really make this up. Whoever comes after Trump, there won't be any difference, I think, though.
That's right. And people forget this, but Clinton in 1992, when he was running for the presidency, he was a Bernie Sanders Democrat. He was populist. He was anti-free trade. He was anti-NAFTA. And then when he came to power, he became a neoliberal. He was more conservative, more pro-business than even the Republicans. So it doesn't really matter who you elect. The empire is still going to be in charge.
Yeah, it's a good point. But how does this all end then? Because the U.S. empire, it can't really go on if it loses in Iran. And I don't, as you said as well, there's no good pathway to a victory in Iran. Not that the American military is all powerful, and it's powerful, and it's not as if the Trump has too many restraints on himself. He can knock out nuclear reactors if he wants. Doesn't seem to be any limits. But again, the Iranians' ability to fight, it doesn't really require them to have an army that is as powerful as the Americans. They have the cheap missiles, cheap drones. They have the favorable geography. So how do you see this thing playing out?
I think for the next year, it will seem as though the Americans are winning. Trump's going to go to China, and eventually China and the United States will come to an agreement that's going to look very good for America, and Chinese are going to agree to buy up more U.S. debt. And this war in Iran, even though in the long term America's going to lose this war, In a short term, the Americans are going to be able to inflict tremendous damage on the Iranians, especially economically. So in the short term, it will look as though the American empire is winning. But in the mid...
Wendy's went back to the kitchen to give our famous spicy chicken sandwich a total upgrade. More crunch, more flavor, with heat that just hits. Is this our best spicy chicken ever? Looks like a yes to me. Spicy chicken just got better at Wendy's.
Trying to predict the future is a hazardous occupation. The only thing we can be sure of is that it will be absolutely...
To long term, we know exactly what happens in these situations, which is the empire breaks out into civil war. Just look at any history. Empires in decline have many characteristics. Corruption, decadence, low fertility rates, mass immigration. And then two very common symptoms of an empire decline are one, wars overseas, and two, civil wars, right? So if Trump seeks a third term, and I have very good reason to believe that he will seek a third term, he will get a third term, this is going to ignite a civil war in America between two major factions. You have the Wall Street financiers who have been in control of America since the Clinton years, basically. And then you have the tech oligarchs, people like Larry Ellison, Sam Altman, Peter Thiel, who are trying to displace the financiers and control Washington, D.C. in order to create an AI surveillance state that would benefit them. And Trump is very much their agent, their champion in this cause. And so how civil war would start is that these two different factions would finance different opposition groups, and these opposition groups would have militias on the ground, creating as much civil chaos as possible. And so if Trump were to get a third term, you can expect that there will be a lot of violence, political violence throughout America in his third term.
Yeah, one of the reasons I was initially optimistic when Trump was running was, well, first of all, he was talking about ending wars, but again, what he says doesn't necessarily mean that much. But the overall issue, I thought, which was genuine, was the idea that he, genuinely believed that in order to save the American Republic, they would have to start to wind down the American empire. That is, the American empire had exhausted itself. It's exhausted its resources, it's being balanced internationally. If you're going to double down on empire now, it would kill possibly the republic. And I thought that genuinely I thought this was good for the world in order to scale back the empire, save the American Republic as an important, pole of power in a multipolar world. I thought all of this made sense, but he seems to go all in now on restoring the empire. But how do you see then this imperial decline? Because it's not the first time in history we had imperial decline. You talked about mass immigration. You talked about the economic inequality, the social disruption, the political system beginning to fail, and it is concerning to see the American institutions no longer working as they were supposed to. So, what is it that you see in the American imperial decline?
Right. So the main characteristic of American imperial decline is hubris, right? Where Washington, D.C. has become a bubble. And it's impossible to reason with anyone in this bubble. They are, it is very much an insular, incestuous community of people who think alike. So remember back in Trump's first term. And I think in Trump's first term, he's very much MAGA. He very much wanted to end these wars overseas. He was very naive. And he wanted to build a wall in Mexico to stop immigration. He actually wanted to fulfill his campaign promises, which is rare in American politics. And in his first term, what happened? What happened was the entire American media started to attack him. His own cabinet leaked unflattering information about Trump. American generals refused to follow Trump's orders. Trump ordered a withdrawal from Syria. They ignored him. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, called the Chinese and told the Chinese, ignore this guy. He's not in charge. That's treason. There was the Russiagate hoax, where they insisted that this guy was was an agent of Putin. And they had this huge investigation. A former FBI director, Robert Mueller, was forced to exonerate Trump. So the first term, it was all of Washington, D.C. was trying to destroy Trump. And in Trump's mind, that 2020 election was stolen from him. And even today, he insists that it was stolen from him. January 6th seemed as a deep state conspiracy to impeach him, to make sure he can never run for president again. So that's what happens in Washington, D.C. If you try to defy the empire, they will find every way to destroy you. Once Trump left office, they raided his house at Mar-a-Lago because apparently he had some confidential files. Everything in Washington, D.C. is confidential. Everyone in Washington, D.C. has confidential files at home. Why did they target him? They conducted lawfare against him. They tried to bankrupt him. They tried everything they could to destroy him. So that's what happens when you try to defy the consensus in Washington, D.C.
Well, again, I think it's important to again draw distinction between the U.S. Republic and Empire, because if you think that the Republic itself is falling apart, you would expect to see massive, lack of social cohesion. You would see cultural and moral collapse, growing economic inequality. I don't know how, and we see a lot of these things. Are there other variables you're looking at when you assessing the health of the patient, that is the American Republic, during these efforts to restore the empire?
Look, I think that the American Republic is one of the most resilient systems in the world. They have 50 states, and all 50 states are different. And so go back to COVID, right? So you go in Canada or Europe, well, you have to take the vaccines because the bureaucracy can enforce its will on you. But in America, if you didn't like the bureaucracy, you move to another state, and you could avoid the vaccines. So that's a great thing about America. And that's what makes America so resilient. So I understand the American empire is in decline and it's going to collapse eventually. But I would not bet against the American Republic. There are certain areas in America that continue to be very dynamic. For example, Texas and Florida.
Yeah, no, I often make the comparison between the U.S. and Europe, because in Europe they often think of themselves as being more stable. The governance is more responsible, but it's even they look at the U.S. is said as a big echo chamber. But at least in the U.S. you do have different views. You have different pockets. In Europe now, it's not it's really one big echo chamber. It's one position you can have on key foreign policy issues. Everything is framed in normative language, where essentially if you don't agree with your government, it's because, well, you have bad intentions. You are, treasonous. I mean, at least in the United States, they do have conversations. In Europe, it's dying off very quickly. But my last question was, how do you see, typically from watching, civilizational decline and all, how do you see the U.S. empire going here and the wider political West? Do you expect a continuing gradual decline as we've seen over the past years, or just a quick collapse?
Yes, I think there are three major symptoms of an empire in decline. They are bureaucratization. You have this huge imperial bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. that's no longer accountable to the people. You have financialization, where Wall Street is in control. You have individualization, which is like everyone sees themselves as an island. You lose social cohesion. You lose the capacity to stand together. But at the same time, I see in America a growing movement of people who want to restore the American Republic. And these people are what we call Christian nationalists. And Tucker Carlson definitely falls into a camp who believes that America is a republic and it should be a Christian republic. And I think that really is a solution to imperial decline, where if America were to embrace Christianity, then I think that would save the republic.
Play solo, after work, at your own pace, no stress.
Yeah, no, well, this wider idea that religion helps to keep, a state or a civilization together, it's and also to keep its morality and vigor. This is ideas of Tocqueville, though. He argued that the American liberalism, the focus on individualism, what made U.S. liberalism sustainable in terms of not just succumbing to complete hedonism, a little bit like the direction it's taken over the last few decades, was because the spirit of religion would always balance the spirit of liberty. That you would have this balance. The liberty wouldn't again begin to degrade itself into this horrible hedonism. But he also warned, though, that over time the liberal ideals, individual focus, would begin to seek to liberate themselves from any restraint, which includes religion. So it just seems very difficult for the Christianity essentially to restore some common identity in America today, though, in order to, I guess, revive the idea of a collective consciousness, a common cause, something along these lines.
Right. I completely agree with the sentiment. America was founded on two pillars. The first pillar, of course, is Enlightenment, secularism, and the second pillar was Puritanism, like Protestantism. And so I completely agree with you in that, America has shifted too extreme into the Enlightenment. It's embraced secular, liberal democracy, and it needs to restore balance by returning to its Christian roots. But I still think that America has so many advantages. It's still a very prosperous place where people are hardworking, where you still have a lot of freedom, where people still take the Constitution very seriously. And once they start to fully embrace their Christian heritage, then I think that a lot of the great advantages of America can be restored.
Yeah. Well, no matter how this new world war pans out, at least the world will look very, very different when this begins to come to an end, which I don't see coming for many years to come. But nonetheless, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you, Glenn.
Cool. Follow me.